Special Rapporteur, Dr. Ahmed Shaheed. He's the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Religion or Belief. My name is Bobby Herman. I'm Vice President for International Programs here at Freedom House, which has been a strong and consistent advocate for religious freedom during its 7.5 decades history of advancing democracy and human rights worldwide. In our research, in our advocacy efforts, including at the United Nations, and in our programs on the ground, we are acutely aware of the integral relationship between freedom of religion or belief, human rights more broadly, and vibrant democratic societies. Before I return to Michael Dora, he's the Director of Government Affairs and the main representative to the United Nations for the Center for Inquiry, and he will be introducing our distinguished guest. Let me offer just a few words to help frame our discussion. All around the world, authoritarian governments, and even some nominally democratic ones, as well as non-state actors, are systematically violating human rights and democratic norms, certainly including freedom of religion or belief. There is nothing more fundamental, more personal than one's faith, or to subscribe to no religious tradition at all. Every day we are reminded that religion and religious identity is a powerful force in contemporary world politics. It is often at the heart of a wider struggle for freedom. And it is also at the center of some of the most intense schisms and conflicts, and not just in the Middle East, leading some to conclude there are irreconcilable differences in worldviews across at least some religious communities and between religious and secular traditions. In far too many countries, members of faith communities confront an array of obstacles and run the risks of imprisonment, harassment, or even death for simply trying to exercise their fundamental right to practice their faith or to embrace agnosticism and atheism. Whether it's Yazidis in Iraq, Rohingya in Myanmar, practicing Muslims in Central Asia, Baha'i in Iran, Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia, or growing anti-Semitism across Europe, freedom of religion or belief is under threat. Some have used religion as a divisive or even violent force to impose a particular worldview. Others have sought to suppress the mere peaceful expression of faith, viewing any alternative source of influence to the dominant political structure as a potential existential threat. Against this backdrop of profound challenges, we have come together to learn more and hopefully to take away some encouragement from progress in the struggle for religious freedom and building more open-minded, inclusive, and vibrant societies. So what we're going to do after Michael comes up and introduces Dr. Shaheed, then I will sit down, have a conversation, have a number of questions that I will pose to Dr. Shaheed, and then of course we're going to open it up. We'll save a lot of time. We know there's a lot of expertise in the audience. I'm told that some of you actually even saw Dr. Shaheed or participated in an event earlier today, which tells me that he's great if you've come back for more. So with that, Michael, please.
Thank you, Robert. I appreciate that. So as Robert said, I am the Director of Government Affairs and the main representative to the United Nations for the Center for Inquiry, which is an educational and advocacy organization that advances secular government and humanist values, including freedom of religion, belief, and expression. As a consequence of my being the main representative to the United Nations for the Center for Inquiry, I am engaged at the UN headquarters in New York and at the Human Rights Council sessions on issues related to freedom of religion, belief, and expression. And at the UN headquarters in New York, there are NGO committees comprised of various different non-governmental organizations that care about the various different human rights areas within the United Nations. And there is an NGO committee on freedom of religion or belief, which has worked traditionally very closely with the Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief to host a series of events each fall when the Special Rapporteur visits the General Assembly to deliver their annual report. Now, There is a vibrant civil society community on freedom of religion or belief in New York, but in DC there is also a very vibrant community on freedom of religion or belief, and I think one that's getting bigger and bigger by the day. Bobby mentioned this morning that there was a civil society meeting that was with the International Religious Freedom Roundtable, which is a kind of non-group coalition that exists on Capitol Hill to advance international religious freedom. Anyway, in October, when Dr. Shaheed visited, we started talking with the committee and with his staff assistants and said, you know, you should really make a trip down to Washington, D.C. and meet with some civil society groups down there. And so we started having conversations about that. The Center for Inquiry has long worked with Freedom House on a variety of different issues related to freedom of religion, belief, and expression. And therefore, we're in this room today. So that, I just wanted to give you some context as to how this event has come about, and I think one of the really important aspects of this event hopefully will be that the Special Rapporteur will learn more about civil society actors here in DC and the stuff that they're doing, and vice versa. So, the Special Rapporteur, the current Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief is Dr. Ahmed Shaheed. He is previously the Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Iran. He began his mandate on freedom of religion or belief in November 2016, and just a couple weeks ago delivered his first report to the Human Rights Council, which you can find on his website, which you can do just by Googling Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief. He is also a lecturer in human rights in the School of Law and the Human Rights Center at the University of Essex, and chairperson of the Universal Rights Group, which is a Geneva-based international human rights think tank launched in January 2014. He's a career diplomat who has twice held the office of Minister of Foreign Affairs in the Maldives, and also led efforts in the Maldives to embrace international human rights standards between 2003 and 2011, roughly. And last but not least, he is also, according to my calculations, the United Nations Special Rapporteur with the most Twitter followers at 31.5 thousand right now. You can follow him on Twitter at Ahmed Shaheed. And I think that you should, because he's posting a lot of great stuff related to freedom of religion or belief. So without further ado, Robert Herman and the Special Rapporteur.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael.
Dr. Shaheed, so welcome. I know this is a very skilled audience when it comes to these matters, but I thought it would be still important for you to talk a little bit about your role as Special Rapporteur. Tell us a little bit about what the mandate is, not just in general for Special Rapporteurs, what role do they play, and then focus a little bit more on your specific mandate.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me here. I'm very delighted to be here one more time. The UN system of special rapporteurs is a system which brings together experts who are not part of the UN but independent persons who work for the UN to look at specific country situations like Iran or Somalia, or thematic issues like religious freedom or poverty and so on. And what we do is we look at individual cases of people whose rights are being violated to see if we can talk to the governments to address their situations. We study various issues and challenges with regard to that right and report to the Council and the General Assembly each year. We visit countries which they are concerned to examine how they are doing in terms of good practice or challenges in the area, and make recommendations on what can be done by both the governments and the UN system as a whole to address the issues concerned. So we monitor, advocate, and recommend matters relating to specific themes or countries. The FORB mandate, to use the acronym used by the Oslo Coalition to summarize the actual reference to freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief. So rather than say every time I say FORB, is mandated to look at globally respect for that right in various parts of the world. Look at the various reasons for the rights violation. Look at emerging trends and challenges and recommend ways in which they can be addressed. To also look at individual cases, advocate on their behalf, and to in particular take note of the gender dimension with regard to FORB and its violations across many countries. So briefly, that's what I do as a for mandate holder.
Can you say a little bit, again, many people in the room know this, but the role that civil society plays in their relationship with special rapporteurs, both in the countries where you may visit, but also the community, many of whom are here today?
Well, civil society is the lifeblood of the UN human rights system. Without their engagement, the system will collapse. So before I would undertake a visit to a country, I will contact the community of NGOs there, independent ones, identify the issues that they wish to raise, discuss persons that may be useful to meet, both as experts in the country situation or as victims of country's actions, and then discuss with them what is the best way I can understand what's happening in the country, of course, together with the government of the country concerned. They also have a say in what my program actually includes. But it's up to me to decide how far that negotiation will take place. After the visit, they play a vital role in publicizing the findings of the visit, because that would be a picture of what's happening in the country, and then make recommendations on what's to be done. And they have a vital role to play in making sure the country actually follows up on that. Because I would then move to the next country concerned, and it's up to the NGO community to see they keep tabs on what's going on, report back to me or other parts of the UN to make sure that the visit results in a change process that happens in the country.
Let me ask you one related question. The issue of reprisals has become more and more prominent. The UN and we, Freedom House and other organizations deal with that. People who speak with special rapporteurs, people who leave the country, then maybe are at the Human Rights Council. I'm sure you've anticipated some of this. So is there any thoughts on how you will engage governments on the issue of reprisals?
Firstly, a preventive approach is very desirable. So I make sure that I take every precaution to avoid exposing people who speak to me to danger from the country government's concerned. I'm happy to say on the Iran mandate, despite Iran's rather obnoxious policy of trying to target, victimize people who speak to various UN officials, I was able to maintain 100% record in terms of not exposing anyone to challenge, although government of Iran would at random pick up people and accuse them of having cooperated with me. So in the current mandate too, I would have to be extremely careful not to expose people to reprisals. But the UN system takes this very seriously. You would understand that, you would know that just last year, the UNSG Secretary General appointed a special official, the Under Secretary General of in New York, mandated to look into reprisals. Right. What we do now as practice is, if we hear about a reprisal case, I will immediately write to the Secretary General, and he will publish that country's name and the situation and the details in an annual report. So a bit of naming and shaming goes into that, and also advocacy on behalf of that person or persons to see if they can have their rights restored or issue remedied as quickly as possible.
This is, as we heard before, this is not your first time as a special rapporteur. You had done on the human rights situation on Iran. I'm wondering if there are any lessons that you would draw from that initial experience that would that you'd apply here and make you better at the job the second time around. Any lessons learned, either hard ones or otherwise?
As you was from the question, I was saying, don't do it again. You know, first lesson. No, it was a very challenging mandate, and I'm happy I took it on because there are many issues to be addressed in Iran. The lessons learned are many. One of the most important ones for me is that even a country as close to external engagement as Iran actually cares about its reputation. So when I write a report on Iran or issue a press statement or write a letter to the government about a person's situation, they do take notice and they try to address the issue in some fashion. The first option for them is to deny any veracity in my claims. But if that doesn't become sustainable, then they find other ways of dealing with it. What they find easiest to deal with would be if the criticism came from the United States or Israel, they would say, well, they are not our friends, so they would say this. And then the same treatment from Canada and Europe. But if you extend this to Brazil or the global South countries, so say Brazil, South Africa, the Philippines, and so on, then they actually are quite rattled by that. And I can cite evidence of cases where, when in debates in the UN, when these countries expressed even the mildest concern, that Iran would go back and change their behavior. Even besides that, I think taking an issue with them has often led to some change. So the lesson is, even if a country seems very, very if you like, opaque and obstructive, don't lose heart, just keep on doing it. One of my colleagues at Essex, the late Sir Nigel Rodley, says that human rights work is like dropping a drop of water into a stone. It won't change the first drop, but keep dripping, and it will make a change in the long run.
So in terms of thinking about making changes, you think about your mandate. I read the initial report, your first address that you did to the Human Rights Council, and in there you outlined some of your priorities. So let me ask you to, in some ways, reprise that and talk about some of the main, not just the challenges, but also what you hope to accomplish in your time as Special Rapporteur.
In terms of the top-line priority in my report, I, in fact, called it towards an agenda for implementation. As you well know, human rights are notorious for being on paper and not being on the ground a reality. So the issue I want to address is find ways to close the gap between proclamation and implementation. And this fits in with the UN's growing emerging priorities as well, to address this huge gap between human rights commitments and compliance. So my priority is that I list some ways in which I would be pursuing this. One of these ways would be to look at synergies in the UN system using various UN platforms that are there to create a much wider pressure on the country concerned to address the issues that are raised. Another tool I speak of is advancing what I call FOB literacy. Many countries either willfully or through, I suppose, conceptual confusion, conflate wrong ideas about what's entailed in the FOB. So they misunderstand what FOB entails. For example, they might argue that a secular space is what's required. Therefore, we will expel all religious sentiment from public space. That isn't what we're talking about. They might argue that religious freedom gives a right to suppress women's rights. Again, we're not saying that's what we're talking about. So the need to clarify what the contours of this are. In fact, to the extent that even some of the basic arguments are contested. For example, when I wrote in my report that freedom of religion necessarily entails the right to change one's religion, some governments, some countries felt that I was overstepping my mark there. Or as one delegation said, please pray tell us, what does LGBTI rights have to do with religion? Everything, of course. But of course, the question is, these arguments need to be clarified. So promoting FOB literacy is a second priority. In terms of thematic issues, I speak to the worldwide trend of using security arguments to undermine rights. So there's a global pushback on human rights, which necessarily undermines respect for FOB as well, especially because FOB is both a foundational right, which promotes other rights, also one that depends on other rights. So without Article 19 being realized, freedom of expression being realized, you're really, really hard-pressed to express your faith and belief. So the need to push back on the general human rights front, still using security arguments, is important. What I propose here is to create more understanding that security and human rights are in a positive relationship. They're not in a zero-sum trade-off, because without security, you couldn't have human rights. Without human rights, you couldn't sustain security for a long time. And then finally, I also speak to growing trends of what I call politicization, using religion in politics in ways that grossly undermine rights of communities which are not in a majority situation. So these are the main issues I want to talk about. And I also speak about the need to have my own capacity developed of the UN mandate to enable me to utilize the growing interest amongst various actors to commit themselves to promoting FOB. For example, we now have an international contact group of countries to promote FOB, a number of countries with ambassadors focused on religious freedom, as well as parliamentarians for FOB from a number of countries. So a growing investment from many countries in this area means the UN can play a role as a focal point for this activity in trying to bring these different communities together.
You're talking about some of the misconceptions, so FOB literacy sounds like a very good idea. Sometimes these misconceptions are convenient, right? They're used as how do you, knowing that that's the case, when you engage with these governments, how do you do that? How do you take the argument apart when you know it's just really a facade? It's not really what they necessarily believe. They're not really confused. They're using it for their own other agenda that they have.
Well, no government is a monolith. Most governments are not monoliths. Yeah. You have a variety of factions and competing voices in a government. So when you talk through an issue repeatedly, then you begin to see cracks develop. But in general, the human rights community has to understand or has to deal with the challenge between lack of political will and capacity. So which is a trick to find out. Many countries don't have the political will to make the changes. Some countries who have the will may lack the capacity to change. Many who have no will demand more capacity. Right. So we have to navigate this sort of, this fine line between the two and make sure that you engage with a wide set of people so that you get your message in to widest community of people and then see if you can work from there. That's why I'm saying it's important to engage with the NGO community. There can be very powerful independent voices which can be sort of an ombudsperson perspective on what the government says. Very often government says something outside the country and something else in their own language in their own country. So they try to play these different constituencies off as well. So the more you speak to a government through different approaches, the more you expose insincere behavior on the part of governments.
I agree very much with the point about no governments are monolithic. The question is, how do you identify those, especially in more restricted political environments, how do you identify those who might be favorably inclined to moving the country forward and on FORB, for example? How do you do that when they may be keeping their heads down in there somewhere, wherever they are in the bureaucracy or elsewhere? Yeah, FORB is a particularly difficult subject to identify who the people who might want to be your allies are, because very often blasphemy laws, apostasy laws are used to lethal effect, deadly effect, to silence people who dissent. So that's a difficult thing. But the more you engage with the community of people, the more you learn there's nuance to what's been said to you. But as a UN official, I take respect as the starting point for every government, perhaps bar North Korea, I should say. But respect is the initial starting point, but it will soon dissipate if the governments don't reciprocate with equal respect to you as well, which can be demonstrated through lack of sincerity in how they deal with you. But at any point, there should be candor in what I say. So what I do is write letters to governments on both violations of individual rights or general patterns, if a law, for example, is being developed. These letters are very candid, they're very direct, they level allegations because that's what they're called as well. But they do ask government to refute first if the information is incorrect. But on the presumption the information is correct, ask them to do X, Y, and Z. So despite that respect, we do not pull our punches when it comes to demanding what governments ought to do to address various situations that are in the country. I think everybody can understand the advantages and the benefits of engaging with government, especially as you said, they're not monolithic, so you want to identify those who might be potential allies. What are some of the risks of engaging some of these governments, especially ones that as you said, they may be insincere? You don't necessarily get to choose, well, you do decide where you want to go, whether you can get in is another question, but sometimes there are insincere governments who will invite you, other times there are ones who want you to come in and genuinely are interested. So how do you navigate that? How do you make sure that, again, there's no risk involved? I don't mean physical risks to you, but I'm just saying one could imagine being used and other things, and we've seen this before. Oh yes, we invited this special rapporteur, and so therefore we have nothing to hide. We've got a very good record, et cetera, et cetera. And how do you avoid that?
Well, I teach a module at Essex University on just this subject, on human rights diplomacy, arguing both as diplomacy is positive and what you call counter-diplomacy. So it's very often the case that governments will say, oh, we're open to everybody, but we only want people whom we like to come there. So we tick a box saying, this country is open. Exactly. Iran, for example, has said they welcome all rapporteurs anytime to come to the country, but it was an invitation. So the box is ticked, right? It's part of some 120 countries who do that. So we think it's a very positive country. But then who's been there? Nobody for the past, 12, 13 years now, nobody's been allowed into the country. So countries are very good at using what I call, measures that will give them the brownie points, but not the substance in terms of what's happening. So how do you actually address this issue? By making sure that you include in your recommendations things that will require them to make that shift. So not simply saying, okay, can you let a rapporteur go to the country, but you must let rapporteurs of this X, Y, and Z mandate go there. So Iran's been saying we want to receive 2 rapporteurs to the country. They're saying rapporteur on sanctions and rapporteur on right to food. I spoke to my colleagues when I was a rapporteur. I told them, you can go, but you should realize that sanctions are about to be lifted or have been lifted. So what are you trying to examine? If it's right to food, I tell her, okay, you can go if you wished, but is there a famine in Iran, or would you rather go to Somalia or some other place? So how do you want to use your two visits a year to maximum effect? So I think one has to be both open to what the other is saying to hear the full meaning of it. At the same time, be prudent enough to understand that in my engagement with Iran, I made sure that I spoke both the English statements in the UN framework, but also had this translated and put into Persian for people to know. I also made sure that the government's response to my reports in English, in fact, they rival my reports in length, I also put back to the people in Iran so they can also read what the government is saying. So you have to use multiple channels, multiple strategies, and be very resourceful and prudent to make sure that they're not tripping you and that you're able to walk with them to some distance.
Of course, when you also travel to a country, if you get in, that raises, I think, probably expectations on the part of civil society that, you'll be able to, I don't know, come away with concessions is the right, but clearly they think that this is, you're there and it's hoped that this will be helpful, advancing the cause. So when you addressed, do you try to dampen down expectations about what's possible, or how do you have that dialogue with civil society?
Well, managing expectations is perhaps by far the biggest challenge all of us face. Like I said, we are part-time volunteers in this work. But even if a full-time, the UN doesn't have the teeth to go and demand countries to X, Y, and Z. So the first thing is to lay out what is possible from a visit and make sure you structure the visit in a way that you can achieve that maximum within that limited space that you have. So it'll be important to ensure that, say, in the case of Iran, they said I could come to Iran if I would just name 4 cases to look into. I didn't go, I didn't bite, because it'll be important that I go to Iran and be able to speak to people who want to speak to me as well, go to prisons as well. So making sure that they don't manage you, but you maintain your independence is the way to go forward. And also to have constant dialogue with the NGO community to make them understand that here's what you can do, be very frank about what the limitations are, and then operate in that very open framework. I try to be as open, as transparent, as I can be in terms of my dealings with the NGO community. I don't make false promises, but I try every time. But I tell them it's only all I can do is this.
Something you said a few minutes ago, I just wanted to come back to about, I don't think this was your words, but mine, sort of a performance gap that a lot of these governments, and I know that's a larger issue with the UN, the Human Rights Council, for example. So when you have universal periodic review, many of these governments take on lots of the suggestions, and then there's almost no follow-up. And that's something that I think frustrates the governments perhaps, but it certainly frustrates civil society. Say a little bit more, you touched on this briefly, but what can be done sort of after you're there to not just publicize the fact you're there, but to, again, continue to hold governments accountable to things that they may have said to you that they recognize as a problem and that they're prepared to take some steps to move forward?
Right, I think we still have the old naming and shaming in our toolkit that still works in many cases, not every case, but in many cases. Transparency helps. So what can be done and what needs to be done is to ensure that the UN system in the country, and that's beyond the council, I mean the UNDP, the UNICEF officers, the WHO, all of these UN functionaries in the country, they also need to ensure that in their conversation with the government concerned, they bring back these recommendations of the country and ask them for updates as we go along, rather than wait every 4 years to hear about for new promises. At the same time, I also want to apply, as I said in my report, what is called the operational approach to human rights. What this does is it measures both the structure and effort made by states to address an issue. In the old style of implementation, we make a recommendation, and we hope the government will either have a policy proclaimed on that or a law change to reflect that, and we're happy with that. What I'm saying is no. We need to, of course, they should have the law change if it requires that. They must have policy if it requires that. But then we should also be able to look at the budget they put behind the policy. It's no good saying we have a law against domestic violence and we promise to build safe houses. Yeah. We need to go and see, okay, how much budget have we put into this? Have we trained people? Are they being used? And finally, who is going to tell if it's useful? It must be the people who use it. We don't ask the government to describe what's been done here. We need the stakeholders to tell us, in their judgment, what is an effective safe house? Is it because you can access it, or what is it? So the indicators must come from the users. Then we have what we call operational approach, which has the structure, the laws and policies, and the process, the effort, the money, and the trade, and so on, and the indicators determining the success of that effort. If we can do this and apply this in specific country situations, then we begin to address the issue of non-implementation. I also am aware that this won't happen miraculously or overnight, but that's a start. It's a start. This is a practical way of doing something about it.
Absolutely. Let me come back also to something else you said. You'd raised it in passing, but I want to come back about LGBTI and religion. We know this has become a hot topic, certainly in many countries. And we, Freedom House and other organizations that do work with civil society activists in various countries, we know that one of the ways that governments vilify people and vilify those activists is to say that they're purveyors of foreign values, that these are antithetical to our traditions here. LGBTI certainly surfaces often in that regard. What do you say to governments that will say, in our religious traditions, LGBTI is not something that we can countenance, we're not prepared to do that, it's, again, contrary to our traditions here?
Well, there are many ways to deal with it. I can tell you an anecdote which explains this. When I was in the Maldives, I did the first Maldives UPR at the UN. This was about 6 years back, and of course, naturally, we feel a lot of questions about LGBTI community in the Maldives. And I got 16 recommendations on this, and one of the ambassadors of Chad thought he would help me, stood up and said, the Maldives should reply to this by saying, you're an Islamic country, and therefore you will only apply these laws subject to Sharia law and cultural relativism. I told the ambassador, thank you for your offer of help. However, the government I am in is committed to universal human rights, and I can't pledge to you today we will change our laws, because it's not me to do that. I can pledge that the government will not victimize anybody or discriminate anybody on any account. So non-discrimination, equality can be applied to everybody, even in the current context, but the rest may take some time to come. So the first thing is to tell everybody equal citizenship and equal rights. The human rights framework begins with the recognition that the foundation for peace, justice, and freedom in the world rests on the recognition of the inalienable and equal moral worth of everyone. So we need to get back to the fundamental equality of everybody. There's no government who would say that we believe inequality is a basic principle we have to uphold. They always come down to citizenship being equal and all of that. So we can contest on that ground. I also tell to many people, if you actually examine your origins of homophobia and so on, can you tell us what's in some context you could refer to, say, literature from their countries going back, say, a few hundred years, which were not homophobic, but have over time become homophobic. So my question to them is, how do they then say this culturally authentic for your case? You have developed sort of attitudes over time. So culture, first of all, changes. That's something you should understand. And secondly, that you can also go back to your own resources and find more tolerant and more less homophobic, in fact, tolerant attitudes towards others. So there's a range of ideas you can use. The law is one thing, and I use it as well, that by law, everybody has to have equal rights, and that's something a government should be able to articulate. The next is, I had a delegate come and tell me, how dare you tell us about, the question was put to me like this, how can you demand that the mosque perform the same-sex marriage? I said, no, I'm not asking that. I'm saying the mosque don't interfere the civil marriage between same-sex people. I'm not asking the mosque to do anything that they would want to do, but the mosque should not interfere in a civil registry which may be trying to do a same-sex marriage. So there is a willful misconception that often used to underscore, there's of course prejudice, I'm not denying that, but is often supported by willful manipulation of that prejudice to homophobic ends. I wanted to pivot back to something that, again, when I read one of your statements, you talked about one of the priorities was mainstreaming religious freedom. On the one hand, I think most of us know what mainstreaming is, but it'd be good for you to elaborate specifically in this context. And sort of, why is even mainstreaming necessary? Because by saying that, it suggests that it isn't now. And then so what are the obstacles as to why that's not happening? I think I and many others have observed that sometimes the FORB is a little bit on the outside. They're not really part of the, as you said, the mainstream in terms of, not necessarily traditional human rights groups, but those that have been around for a while, that are seasoned. And I think sometimes the hesitance runs both ways, actually. But if you could say a little bit about mainstreaming and what can we do about that? Well, it's a long answer there as well. You will recall the Time magazine cover from April 50 years ago. This week, and there's been reincarnated in a different format this week, which said God is dead. Or is God dead was the question.
Is God dead, I think, yeah.
And of course, if you look at the UN's conception and evolution, UN is quite secular in its self-perception, and doesn't take religion very kindly or very easily. And many of its officials are not trained in either religious literacy or in phobe literacy. So they find discomfort in dealing with this. So they're very often not geared to or comfortable with dealing with issues of religion. That's one element. And the next is very often issues of religion are taken very passionately by some communities. So very often we find UN officials sort of take the soft approach, the soft line, soft pedaling on issues that on line of least resistance. So they might think, they in fact have told me in some situations that they might need to trade access for principle. So if they insisted on certain rights being advanced, then they might lead to sort of a reduction of other programs. So they're much happier stay in the safe area than venture out into areas which are far more contested. But phobe takes even more of a hitting than this. One example, of course, is if you look at the Universal Periodic Review, when countries can make any amount of recommendations that they can to any country they want once every 4 years, covering every country, we found that, as my report points out, only 2.5% of all recommendations were on phobe. So it is less than minuscule, I suppose, in terms of the number. Of that number, only 20%, 23% were accepted. So you can see how that is even less. And then in terms of how many were implemented, nobody has been counting. So it probably would be very low in any case, but nobody's been counting as well. What can be done by mainstreaming, what I mean is that the UN system at large begin to embrace the importance of phobe in its engagement with countries, begin to realize that without phobe, you actually create more space for all the other challenges, things like lack of pluralism. You can't imagine a democracy without respect for religion. It's an impossibility, but there are many who would still argue they can limit phobe and go ahead. I was meeting Timothy Shah at Berkeley Center, thank you. And he's done a great study on 8 pathways to start of flourishing through phobe. And we also see that it's quite intuitive. If we can't let people contest what the imam says or what some other person says, then religious bigotry will have a license. But unless you had the freedom to contest what people said about religion, then you would not develop a discourse which will contest the bad ones. So, so in other words, for development and for other UN agenda to succeed, it needs to understand that phobe is a central part of it, a foundational right without which other rights will not survive.
Let me, I had mentioned about the suppression of these rights in restricted political environments. But one of the phenomena we're also seeing that Freedom House and others have chronicled is a rising tide of xenophobia, might call it the rise of intolerant populism in democratic countries. How is that challenge a little bit different? I mean, it echoes some of the things we see in other countries, but is it easier to engage with those democratic governments? I would say probably yes, but what are some of the other challenges that are merged with what we're seeing, some of these trends in democratic societies?
Well, it's definitely easier to engage with these countries because there are multiple points of entry, and also more prospects for change because there are still public institutions which can at some point draw lines on what a government of the day might want to. But having said that, populism with xenophobia, with identity politics can corrode all of these things over time. Yeah. And we've seen very, very disturbing developments in many countries. What is even more disturbing is that some of these countries have been champions of religious freedom in the recent past or in the present time. So they are setting a very bad example for others in terms of what others might emulate in these situations. I think the thing to do is to, again, create, like I said, more cross-boundary understanding, things that will reduce the othering of communities, things that will reduce the tribalism that now seems to be sort of taking hold. So part of my campaign in the UN, and the mandate, is to promote cross-boundary communication, cross-boundary dialogue, to promote the idea of empathy and solidarity, not just speak up to the people of your own faith community, but also for everybody on principle, because we are all in the same boat. To quote an Iranian philosopher here, Soros, he said, we are all in the same ship, same boat. If one of us drills a hole in one part of the ship, the whole thing goes down. So we need to understand that cross-boundary sort of empathy we need to generate.
And maybe you could elaborate a little bit on the, not just intersectionality, but also, as you said, across the faith traditions. What is the role for the religious community, especially in places where there is more democratic space, even as it comes under some threat, but it's there. What can the religious community do? You gave a couple of examples, but are there others? And maybe some successful examples where you've seen combating this across faith traditions.
Right. Well, the UN has a lot of work on this. One thing called the Rabat Plan, a faction now 5 years old, is about how states, governments, and NGOs and others might deal with incitement to religious and racial hatred. So that's a long document on specific issues, from laws to interfaith dialogue to replacing hate speech with good speech. These sort of recommendations. Just last week, I went to Beirut for a follow-up on Rabat, where we spoke about 18 commitments to operationalize faith in Forbes. What can faith communities and belief communities do together or separately to ensure that human rights are advanced? So in terms of best practice, what we've seen in the recent past is when there have been people who create, who advocate hate speech or make hate-inspired statements, we've found other people come back and counter that with positive speech. So the good practice appears to be to counter hate speech with positive speech. The bad practice would be try to criminalize hate speech and to incite violence on that basis. So you get both as well. But the good examples are when there have been efforts made not to criminalize an action that is offensive, but to counter by positive statements. So you exude and display sympathy and solidarity, empathy and solidarity, rather than take the law to suppress speech.
Which also in terms goes to the values of the society that you're trying to build. Absolutely. Anyway, in terms of inclusion and talks. Get ready with questions. I'm going to open it up in a minute. Let me, if I can, pose one more question, then we'll open it up to our erudite audience here. One of the impediments sometimes to progress on freedom of religion has to do with what I would observe as some measure of siloing, or maybe less charitably sectarianism, even within the Forb community, that people are very focused, maybe understandably, on the particular plight of folks in their religious faith and tradition, but maybe not so much working across. What can be done to help one talk about that issue, and then if there are any particular strategies that you've seen that might be successful in that regard?
My predecessor, Professor Hannah Billiford, produced one report, what they called interreligious communication. If the UN mandate is asked to look at how this can be advanced, so it is part of the ongoing engagement with the mandate. You're right to point out that many communities who petition the UN often petition only on behalf of their own community members, which is natural because they keep tabs on what's going on. It's still a very large community. We talk about people outside in other countries, so that communication channels, information channels are perhaps most readily available in those contexts. But we've also seen increasingly over time, or more recently, of communities speaking on behalf of other communities as well. Right. We can find many examples of, even on the ground, various faith leaders risking their own life to protect other communities. We've seen many examples of that. At the UN level, we also now see increasingly people collaborating together to make a joint point about the underlying principle. And that's always helpful. And it's also important because, like I said earlier, we're seeing a growing trend of global tribalism, of fragmentation of communities in various societies. If you were to advance that, we will have all sort of silos, as I mentioned. But cross-boundary communication would try to bridge these gaps and build bridges across these communities. I've seen examples of this. We have the International Panel of Parliamentarians, which is, in a sense, cross-disciplinary. It covers nations, vocations, and religions in their makeup, working together globally to advance Forb issues. We also have the NGO community in the UN, a very loose federation of different faith-based and belief-based communities, increasisingly finding the space to work together. I am encouraging this trend, both to create those, the intercommunal community linkages, also to address issues of othering, and also to make a bigger impact. Right now, a lot of the NGOs working with the UN are focused on what I call Room 20. That's where the council meets. and they're happy to listen to the debate and go back, and there's not much happening outside in terms of what's going on. But if they're able to mobilize together, then work together, then they can be mobilized globally as a movement to address issues all parts of the world. This is my dream, but I think we can start building this process whereby we encourage, facilitate inter-communal networks and links and mobilize all these networks in support of folk.
Great. Let me invite some questions. There's a microphone, I think. Okay, Azad is bringing up the microphone. Why don't we start right up here up front and we'll work our way down. Okay, so if you can say who you are and try to keep your comments or questions brief. Thank you.
I'm Frank Calzone. I have a question. The Holy Father, John Paul II, when he went to Cuba, asked the Cuban government to close an office. It's called the Office of Religion and Cults. And that office intimidates churches, controls religious practice. But the interesting thing about that office is it's not an office of the Cuban government. It's an office under the Central Committee of the party, of the Communist Party of Cuba. My question is, can the United Nations do something about that? Talk to General Castro and say, why is this thing having to do with religion under the party office?
Let me take one more question, issue up front, and then we'll okay, anybody? Azad, further down, if I didn't see anybody. Yeah. Grab the first person you see. There you go. Okay. Then we'll take it a couple at a time. Yeah.
Hi, Elise Goss-Alexander with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. I was wondering if you could probe a little bit further into the security and FORB relationship there and talk about some of the government policies that you've seen that are helpful in addressing counterterrorism and countering violent extremism without necessarily going into policing ideas and criminalizing speech.
Great. So why don't we go ahead?
Two easy questions, right? Thank you. On the Cuba, first one on Cuba, yes, the UN can actually write to the government of Cuba and ask them to put this office in order, because even if it's a non-government institution, they have a duty to ensure that non-state actors do not violate rights of others. So this is perfectly doable. But the UN would need to have the relevant information on specific issues to make a case as to why that needs to do so. In terms of the CVE, PVE issues, if you look at the UN reports on this subject, countries make reports to the High Commissioner for Human Rights on what they're doing, and there's a lack of good practice in that. So I'm hard-pressed to find good practice in this. The tendency has been to do what I call securitize the debate. That's going more than simply security lens. It's to make sure that it's a process by which once you raise the issue to a security threat, then all debate disappears, and that all measures undertaken are seen to support that security interest. Anyone who questions that is seen as having breached the lines of national loyalty. Some sort of treason or treacherous imputation happens. So it becomes very difficult to contest those issues. The trend has been in many cases to ignore the human rights dimension and to sort of put the security angle on top. Asma Jahangir, my predecessor two months before, was very clear that states must empower security forces with the requisite tools to address issues of violence and terrorism. There's no doubt about that. But the issue is they also must do due diligence to ensure that the policies actually do no more harm, but only address the issue as required. And what we find is when they do harm, when they do cause harm, they actually are counterproductive. That they could be reinforcing future, if you like, blowback on security of those situations. There are many programs which have at one time or other been called model or effective de-radicalization programs. But if you examine them further, there are question marks about how effective they have been. So I am not in a position to recommend what's good practice or best practice here, but the key point here is to inverse the argumentation here, to understand that without human rights being protected, security cannot be achieved in the long run. And that once we disproportionately reduce human rights, then we create more tensions in the short term as well. And the best solutions have been to ensure that you give the tools to the security forces but you keep in place effective oversight mechanisms. The debate isn't all that different from what people are asked to do in the case of digitization and privacy. There's a need to ensure that the law enforcement don't get marginalized in this new online world, but at the same time to ensure that the tools they have are not cannot be used without accountability or impunity. So the proper and effective safeguards have to be built in. I have no quick direct answer to your question, unfortunately.
I'm just curious, when you speak with governments, which you'll be doing hopefully a lot of in the next few years, when you point out to them that this is oftentimes counterproductive, right? The suppression of religious faith is something that certainly won't automatically, but certainly creates more ripe conditions for radicalization. They shake their head and they say, yeah, we know, but, or we disagree with the premise. What do you hear from them?
Well, when it is security issues, they just tell you don't know. They assume there's a higher level of protection for this argument, yeah, which is a screen from critical inquiry, and that itself is a problem, because if you have any public policy that's above criticism, then you're bound to make mistakes. It should become evident to everybody. But the best argument is to demonstrate that when countries try to limit speech, is the best example, the speech and association assembly, in the name of security, and they target religious communities. If they're not careful to ensure that they leave the space for peaceful expression of religious sentiment, then A, they drive the movement underground. Right. They lose what's going on. B, they lose the opportunity to have the debate from the tradition to contest these claims. So if you have a mullah sending out, or whoever sending out things surreptitiously claiming all sorts of restrictive claims, and no space to express dissent, either because it's the mainstream view or because you don't have the space to discuss topics on religion or security, then there's no public debate. All you have is your version and their version, and they will collide to deadly effect.
Right, thank you. Okay, is that right in front of you? And then let's take the young woman back here on the right, and then we'll okay, good. We're working our way down.
Okay. I'm Masud Idris. I'm the Nigeria Country Advisor for Religious Freedom for Center for Islam and Religious Freedom. In the beginning, you mentioned your office studies dimension of religious freedom issues in some countries. Then you also mentioned manipulation of prejudice. Again, you mentioned the lack of capacity of some countries to uphold religious freedom. Do you believe that the more we promote education and awareness regarding religious freedom, the more we improve the capacity of communities to promote, to uphold religious freedom, and the capacity of especially vulnerable youth to resist violent groups that mostly utilize the prejudice against some minority religions? Do you believe promoting education regarding this can help uphold the concept of religious freedom around the world? And secondly, do you see a situation coming whereby your office or the UN in general working with an organization, a sister organization like UNESCO, to promote religious freedom issues in school curriculum or something like that? Thank you.
Okay, why don't we just stay, yeah, if you can, one on to the right there, great, and then we'll.
Thank you for the presentation. Kate Nahapetian with the Armenian Legal Center for Justice and Human Rights. I wanted to ask how you prioritize all the myriad of religious freedom issues in the world. Do you look to see if a particular religious community is in mortal danger rather than a religious community that is just facing discrimination? Like the case of the Armenians in Turkey and Christians in general, just 4 generations ago, this indigenous community comprised 25% of the population, but today they're less than 1%, and they continue to face discrimination, state-sponsored discrimination, where people are fearful of even revealing that they're Christian. Their church properties are stolen, and just last month, the Turkish government is interfering in the election of their leader and declaring their rightful ability to elect a leader, quote, illegal. So if you could talk about how you prioritize and what you're doing in Turkey in particular. Thank you.
Please.
Okay, thank you. The first question, the short answer is yes. The mandate practice shows the emphasis we have placed on education at two levels. One is, like I said, with UNESCO, work with UNESCO to ensure that we look at school curricula are designed in ways that will facilitate understanding of other faiths positively, or at least not negatively. Or that young children learn about the other religions in a respectful fashion. That's important because we often fail in doing that, and as a consequence, we create generations of people with misunderstandings or fear or hatred of other communities. At another level, FOB literacy is about the human right, or what is intended the human right to religious freedom. So people we know we're not asking them to change their theological views. They can remain theologically opposed to other views, but they can accept that everybody has equal entitlement to a human right, and then what that human right actually means. So both parts of this are important. I hope to work with UNESCO in looking at the subject of school instruction, and also work with other parts of the UN to promote FOB literacy in a more general way. In terms of prioritizing, I am like I said, a part-time person working for the UN with a day job at Essex University. I have 2 staff at the UN who are full-time, but also do a bit of other work as well. So the capacity we have to monitor global trends is limited. But I'm building my capacity through external support as well. What we do is, when we get information about rights violations, we take all seriously. We don't try to prioritize anything. We take all violations seriously. We try to reach out and find out, establish certain basic elements of what's been told to us. So we need to have certain types of information from certain sources. So it can be media, so it has to be direct from the victim or a reliable advocate for the victim in the country, or someone that otherwise meet those criteria. Once we have that information, then we will write to the country concerned, raising the issues that are triggered by that behavior, and reminding them of the obligations of international law, and asking them to do A, B, and C. And once we do this, the government gets 2 months to reply. They often deny, but then if you keep on writing to them, perhaps in some cases they do make a change. But in any case, we can then publish that letter in a UN document twice a year. At the present time, it's a very, very opaque system. We put all this in a bundle and put somewhere which nobody can see. But I'm hoping to make it a bit more transparent so people can actually view them and take them forward, and perhaps shame the governments that are doing this for failure to address the issues concerned. So the short answer is, I don't prioritize. I use all the information I can access to write communications to the country concerned. So we begin to have that dialogue process with that country. In terms of visiting, yes, I would like to prioritize, but I can only go if states consent to receive me. So while I would like to turn up tomorrow or this year in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Nigeria, Pakistan, India, and so on, I doubt if I can make it this year. So I am going to Ethiopia, Albania, and Brazil, because they have been able to agree to receive me this current year. But I will work with the list I mentioned for the next few years of my mandate to see if I can find any openings. It may not be possible, in which case my alternative would be to turn up at a conference or event like this or some other activity, but then not have a report to the UN. But I can meet with people, understand the situation better, and then discuss that with the government concerned subsequently.
Is there a place that people can donate their frequent flyer miles to you so we can get you to more countries? Okay, in the back, and I'll come back to you. Yep. We got 2 questions back there, and then I know you've had your hand up for a long time, so you're next. Yes.
Hi, Christina Alney with In Defense of Christians in the Middle East. Thank you very much, Dr. Shaheed, for your presentation, and to Freedom House for hosting this excellent discussion. I have 2 questions for you. The first is, can you speak a little bit more about some of the UN arenas in which you expect there to be a robust discussion of some of the 4 challenges that you've mentioned today this year? I'm thinking particularly of the US leadership this month of the UN Security Council, and whether you think that that might be a positive opportunity for a discussion of these issues. And my second question is, you mentioned the investment in the international community in FOB, particularly with the appointment of various ambassadors and of parliamentarians who are focusing on this issue. And can you speak a bit about the prospects for that kind of investment in some of the regions where there are the greatest challenges in the FORB area, and specifically how those communities might empower civil society activists. I'm thinking of individuals like Nadia Murad.
Oh, you're not on.
Thank you, who is a Yazidi activist. So thank you.
And why don't we take one more? Yes, that woman right back there. I'll come back to you.
Hi, my name is Vanessa, and I'm a reporter with Voice of America China branch. And I have two questions. So in February, you expressed a deep concern about the serious religious repression in Tibet, China. So what are your concerns on China's religious freedom, and especially regarding Tibetan Buddhism and Christianity? And the second one is about the US. So you have also talked about President Trump's travel ban in February, saying it breaches Washington's human rights obligations. So do you think religious freedom in the US is getting worse? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, the first question, in terms of whether or not the Security Council format can be used, I think it can be used, but I am not in a position to activate that. It has to come from members of Security Council. I do agree with you that the situation of some of the minorities, communities in the Middle East and some other parts of the world warrant a serious concern by Security Council. I have expressed in my presentation of the Council, the Human Rights Council in March, that some of the communities in the Middle East who have been there for millennia are facing displacement from the region and therefore require serious attention. And that goes beyond the attention of a mandate holder. It requires more serious UN-wide engagement on the subject. I'm aware that this High Commissioner for Human Rights himself has spoken on this subject, has been active on this subject, but it requires, like you said, a Security Council level engagement for there to be sufficient action on the ground for people to react to that. I also want to point out that there are a number of other entry points, like the EU, for example. We've seen envoys for the EU for FORB tour the region. I've read reports of the US ambassador for minorities in the region, Knox Thames, visit the region. So there's been a flurry of activity from various concerned stakeholders trying to address issues concerned. But given the scale of the activity, I would agree with you, the Security Council needs to address that situation there and some of the other regions as well, where there is a similar scale of activity going on. The second question was in two parts, right? So on China, you're right, I did write to the government of China early this year on issues on Tibet. And I think the response may also be posted on the website in Chinese. The summary of the response was that my information was denied by them as being accurate. But I stand by my information because it's a general pattern, not just in Tibet, but other parts where they use very repressive measures to suppress expressions of religion, including in the case of Tibet, of rather humiliating measures being imposed upon religious leaders in the province. So it is a matter of serious concern. I would repeatedly raise the issue with them because it's a pattern, it's chronic, and it requires the attention of the mandate. In terms of the US, yes, I did speak out. I did write to the government of the United States on the initial ban that was put in place together with a few other rapporteurs, the primary one being the UN Rapporteur on human rights, defending human rights while countering terrorism. That's the main person for this. But I joined because the ban seemed to be directed at certain countries with certain religious majorities. So that was a concern I raised. In terms of US, I would rate US as a country with very robust institutions that can still contest various government moves, and we've seen that happen here as well. But it's not immune from the growing global discourse of tribalism and xenophobia and discomfort or even fear about the other. It's been going on for some time now. We had, for example, Martha Nussbaum write a book about 5 years ago now, The New Religious Intolerance, again documenting the same sort of pattern. It's a global pattern. What is more worrying, though, is that when countries which have a tradition of respecting religious freedom also begin to demonstrate symptoms of that behavior.
Well said. Yes, up here, Azad, if you don't mind, all the way up front here. Oh, you got a mic? Oh, okay, this woman has had her hand up for a while. You do that and I'll come right back to you. Right here, and then back to you, sir. Please.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Kitty Wang with Newtown Dynasty Television. It's a Chinese-American TV network. And my question is that last month, Freedom House released a report that's named The Battle for China's Spirit. It talks about the repression on religious groups in China. So one of the most severely persecuted group is Falun Gong, and the persecution has been going on for over 17 years. So I don't know whether you are aware of the situation, and also the organ harvesting is still exists in China today. So thanks.
Yeah.
Go ahead, if you want to take that one. Go ahead.
Right. Yes, I'm aware of the situation in China, and I've written several communications to the government on various subjects. The mandate has been trying to get to China for several years without success. I will repeat the same request to be able to visit China, because there has been no visit to date by any of my predecessors. But we've maintained these communications private because they seem to reply to all our communications, although they don't really have any impact. For the moment, because they haven't said no to a visit, I want to keep the communication going. But I am concerned about the situation of religious freedom in China.
Over here, and there are two right together, right over there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shaheed. And I've met you in New York multiple times, so I appreciate your work. Mushtaba Akhwan, Director of Free Muslim Association. On the case of special rapporteurs, do special rapporteurs of different countries who are neighbors, for example, would you and a special rapporteur on Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq cooperate on the report on Iran, or just a given example, or is it just independent, don't talk to anybody else, because behaviors of one country has dealings with neighboring countries, and their decisions internally kind of affects external measures. So do you work or cooperate with other rapporteurs on particular report, or no? Thank you.
Yeah, please.
My name is Jeffrey Blackwell. I'm with American Atheists. I'm concerned about the intersection of FORB and the rights of the child. It seems to me that in most international law, we prioritize the religious rights of adults, and sometimes that works to the detriment of children. This gap in policy seems to leave children open to abuse, neglect, whether through parents subjecting them to faith healing, not bringing them to doctors, or just abandonment because a 15-year-old doesn't have the same religious views as their parents. Is there any movement to close that gap?
Right, okay, the first question is, yes, we talk to each other, all the rapporteurs. So I am in close contact, my current mandate, with rapporteurs who share similar areas. So the rapporteur on migrants, rapporteur on minorities, rapporteur on free expression, we are in constant touch. In fact, we co-sign most of our communications to government. We don't send individual ones. Very rarely we would do that, only if time didn't permit that. So as a method of work, we try to consult, work together, and speak to a common, if you like, theme, and also develop synergies and share perspectives as well. And beyond the rapporteurs, we also talk to other parts of the UN. So whether we agree or not, I am in constant touch with them. In the case of Iran, I would visit the UNODC, not so much to agree, but to disagree, but nevertheless to talk to them and let them hear from me as well. In my current mandate too, I'm in touch with the UNHCR, because the refugee crisis obviously has intersections with my mandate as well. So we talk to each other, we try to understand from each other different or common perspectives. In terms of, yes, you're right to point to the gap, but when I said FORB literacy, what I meant is to really demonstrate that religion is not a privilege. As a human right, it must fall in line with the framework. it must have understood in that holistic fashion. I always say that Article 18 of the ICCPR, from which we draw the main elaboration of FOB, must be understood with Article 5 of ICCPR, which says that no right in this covenant can be used to destroy any of the other rights that are there. This still doesn't protect children as much as it should. So we then go back to the CRC and look at the committee's jurisprudence and recommendations of what they call the evolving capacities of the child. That parents must respect, and when understanding parental rights with regard to children, we must respect the evolving capacities of children to make decisions on their own. And there is jurisprudence in the UN, in the EU context, definitely, with regard to the extent of parental oversight on interests of the children. So the line we take is, the line we promote is that the best interest of the child is what should be the determining factor in all these situations. How far we can actually implement that in concrete laws is a different issue. But the normative framework is that evolving capacities on the one hand, and the best interest of the child as the bottom line in dealing with these issues.
Any other questions? Let me, if I can, let me ask you actually two very practical things. One, when you're addressing a civil society audience, now we certainly have some folks from the U.S. government as well, and journalists here, but for the civil society folks, those of us who are fortunate enough to live in societies where, for the most part, freedom of religion or belief is generally fairly robust, and they feel an obligation to help. What's their best way to communicate with you? I don't mean your email, but in terms of getting you information or others, what's the best way? And each rapporteur that I've dealt with has sometimes, they don't answer that question exactly the same, but for you, how can you most benefit from and leverage the expertise that exists here and elsewhere?
Thank you. It's a very important question for me, this question. First of all, I understand society is not a black box. There are many different types of NGOs, think tanks, associations here. So the response to them will be different. Yeah. In terms of those who have information about specific country situations or specific cases, I'm very keen to hear from you on those cases reported to me or to my colleagues who can then sort of work with me in generating communications to the country concerned to address the issue concerned. Even if it is not an individual case, even if it's about a bill or some other policy that's emerging or in place, that information in terms of its impact or in sort of foreseen impact would again be useful for me to generate a communication to have a dialogue with the country concerned to address the issue. So that's again vital information that you would have, I would not with two people be able to on my own source. I'm also keen to understand, to learn from your own field work. Some of you undertake research trips to the countries, fact-finding missions of your own, for your own purposes. Again, if you're able to share with me that information, that would enrich the work I do, might even be able to use that in some of my reporting, or certainly with dialogue with the government's concerned. So on all these different activities, I'm very keen to have the interaction with you. You can communicate to me to the UN office, but I also have set up an office in New York here because I need to have the extra capacity, and because you are here, the 3 hours from New York, I think the communication would be perhaps easier given the time difference and everything. So I would invite you to write to me either through my New York office or through my Geneva office or both, so that I can stay in touch with you. I can learn about the concerns you have and communicate with you for more clarification on information that's missing, but also learn from you of your rich expertise in specific areas that you're working on.
Let me ask you one more practical question. We know, as you said, at the end of the day, when you want to go to a country, but it's up to the government to invite you, that's for an official visit. How about unofficial visits? I know we've seen that's being used more and more by some of the special rapporteurs to countries they otherwise can't get access to, but they're invited, whether it's through a local organization, a think tank or something, or a university. Have you given thought to that yet? I don't know if that's even emerged yet as an issue for you, but...
No, that's definitely a vital tool in my toolkit. The convening power of a mandate holder is something that has to be used, as well as the ability to undertake consultations and attend conferences. So I've seen many rapporteurs, including those working on this mandate, go to countries where it's not possible to go on a full country mission, but have a consultation. My Brazil visit initially began as a visit for a conference on FOB, but then after I agreed to go there, the government agreed to have a mission, so I added a mission to that. So it is perfectly possible. I understand some countries have had 2 mandate visits so far out of the total 35 we have visited. So they may be reluctant to take on a 3rd visit without the 120 other states being covered. In these situations, there's still a need, I think, to be there. And so it will be perfectly useful and legitimate to turn up at a conference organized by the civil society of that country or a university or some other association which can sort of bring me in touch with various stakeholders on this subject.
Okay, great. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. Let me mention that one of the things I printed out from your home university, I now know your office hours, so I'm going to let everybody know. Those are Fridays, I believe, from 2 to 5, so
yes, okay.
Feel free to go and continue the conversation.
All right.
Thank you so much for being here. That was great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks.
I believe, from 2 to 5, so
yes, okay.
Feel free to go and continue the conversation.
All right.
Thank you so much for being here. That was great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks.